Well, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're so glad to have you all here today with us. My name is Kim Hopes, and I am the Assistant Director of ABCD Partnerships at the Asset-Based Community Development Institute at DePaul University. I'm here today with April Donner, an ABCD Institute staff member and steward of the Institute, and Ling Do, our DePaul University graduate student assistant, who will both be helping me monitor the chat and answer any technical questions you may have. But before we get started with today's program, I'm going to just quickly go over some helpful tips to make sure that you can get the most out of this Zoom experience. So to reduce noise and distractions, we've had you enter the Zoom call with your microphones muted. So please stay muted, as we should have close to 300 people on today's call. We are recording this session and we'll email you the recording within a few days. For those of you who are joining us online, I'm going to have you take a quick look at the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. I know most of you have been Zooming for the last year and a quarter, so you're pretty experienced with this. But just here you can post any technical questions that you have, and April and Ling will try to help you answer them if you're having any problems hearing or anything like that, or seeing. So John and Paul will talk for about 45 minutes or so in a sort of interview format. And after they talk, we'll open up the conversation for questions from the chat box. So please add your questions to the chat box at that point, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And now I'd like to introduce you to John McKnight. John McKnight began his career as a neighborhood organizer and later co-founded the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, which is here in Chicago, now located at DePaul University. From 1970 until now, John has researched social service delivery systems, health policy, community organizations, and neighborhood policy. He is the author of The Careless Society and co-author of Building Communities from the Inside Out and The Abundant Community. Today, John will be interviewing Paul Bourne of the Tamarack Institute. And now I will turn it over to John to introduce Paul Bourne to you.
Great. Thank you. All of you who are listening should know that here at the ABCD Institute, the power, the engine that makes the whole place work is Kim Hopes. And so we're so happy that she's in charge here. Let me give a little background on today's gathering. I think in Canada has about 1/10 the number of people that we have here in the United States. And yet, in terms of asset-based community development initiatives, I would say there are at least as many in Canada, if not more. Canada has been the most receptive place for using assets as a focus of community development. So we've been in Canada a lot over the years. And wherever we've gone, we kept running into that people are already doing all kinds of wonderful things. And when I'd ask, how'd you get doing that? They'd say, oh, I'm a member of the Tamarack Institute's learning community. And the more I learned about how in small towns and big cities, this Tamarack Institute had been a key influence on local initiatives, I thought I better find out about that. And that's how I came to know Paul Bourne. I'm the co-founder of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, and he's the co-founder of the Tamarack Institute. And I love the way they describe themselves as a learning community. And they have 30,000 members. So we wanted to share all the wisdom we've gained from them with all of you who are joining us today. Paul, let me get here. Paul's bio is that he was the co-founder of Tamarack, and he is also the director of Vibrant Communities, which is especially significant today in our discussion, because within that initiative, there is one called Cities Reducing Poverty, and that's the focus that we're have today. This initiative that Tamarack created has been working in 400 cities in the United States and in Canada in a very novel approach to the reduction of poverty. And Paul has been a guiding light in that effort. He's written 4 books. He's a steward or faculty member of the ABCD Institute. And he has received, I think, maybe the highest civilian honor in Canada. He's a member of the Order of Canada. Now, that's sort of the official stuff about him. But I know other things about him that he forgot to put on his vita. For instance, he forgot to put that in his history, he has been a watermelon farmer, and he is the son of refugees. So let's start there, Paul. Son of refugees, soon to become a watermelon farmer. Tell us how that happened.
Well, again, thanks, John, for all of the good work that you do and Kim does and all the other stewards of ABCD around the world. It's certainly been a huge part of my growth and inspiration. And I think, John, you were one of the first people that I ever met that spoke about community change in some sort of formal way. So way back when I was in my early 20s, you influenced me already back at that point. I also want to recognize Heather Keane, who's here with us today. She's really been the one advancing asset-based community development in Canada. So lots of interesting things there, and maybe she can put in the chat box a link to that site. So John, thanks for interviewing me today. It's a real pleasure. Our family came here in 1949 on the boat Volendam from the Ukraine. We were caught in a really awful situation. We had moved to the Ukraine as kind of cloistered Mennonites, wanting to be away from the world, kind of like Amish. And then communism came along and didn't like anyone that didn't conform, took everything away from us, our way of life, and you know, we're a pacifist people, and yet both of my grandfathers were executed by Stalin in the Ukraine. And so when we had a chance to migrate, we did right after the war. We migrated as displaced persons, and Canada accepted us, and we moved to the west coast, just outside of Vancouver, and started a farm there. It was an interesting time because I grew up in poverty. You can imagine, you know, when you were a refugee at that point, you weren't sponsored. You came with a debt. So whatever it cost the government to bring you here, they gave you a debt that you have to first pay off, kind of like a student loan. It was kind of like a refugee loan, huh? And so we have to pay that off and make a living and so forth. But you know, we formed a community around a place called Ebenezer Mennonite Church. And we were quite cloistered. Like I can still remember, you know, going to school and knowing German better than I did English. You know, the fact that, I didn't realize I smelled, but I did. I smelled like the barn. I smelled like the food we ate. So, I was quite different, but the church was my home. And we would go there 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week, often to play and to eat and to socialize, but mostly to heal. I think it took us as a people almost 20 years to heal. And it was a real challenge to do that. Just one moment. I think, Susan, you're on share screen. There you go.
Yeah, okay.
Thank
And
you.
that was a very interesting point, and it really had an influence on me. The most important thing is that I never really felt like I was growing up in poverty. I felt I was part of a community. We always lived on a farm, so we had enough to eat in that sense. And so that was kind of our life, the early life. And I eventually decided to become a pastor, and left the Fraser Valley to go to seminary. But when I got to seminary, I came to realize that I liked sin too much. Wasn't a good resume builder for me. I'm joking. I wasn't that bad. I was kind of bad, but not that bad. I don't know what it was. I loved business more than I loved church, and so I left after 2 years and came back but my heart was in human development, and I joined a not-for-profit that ran 4 businesses, and helped run those successfully for the first few years. That was my first job, and then it went on from there. Eventually making my way to Ontario, met Marlene, had a family, and that's the end of that story.
Now, you later developed this initiative that we're very interested in particular today, an initiative in which communities are focused on reducing poverty. And how did that get started? And it sounds like it came out of your history in one sense.
Well, John, we started out by founding an organization. It was just after university, called the Community Opportunities Development Association. And we grew it into quite a large organization. We had about 85 staff, 22 different programs. And we were helping people start small businesses. We were helping companies that were closing to relocate workers. We were helping people with job search. We had children's programs. It was a lovely organization, but we saw ourselves as an anti-poverty organization. That we wanted people to have good careers and to have a good life. And we were helping them work toward that. And so around 10 years into that, we were approached by the United Nations, and they declared us one of the 40 best practices in the world. Now, most people get really, wow, isn't that great? 40 best practices in the world. We were stunned. We didn't even know that they knew about us. And we were going like, are you nuts? Like, we're from a little town here in Cambridge, Ontario. How do we suddenly get selected? Well, it seems like we had some folks from, we were trying to figure out our overall cost benefit as an organization, and the word got out. We had one individual from the London School of Economics that was helping us. And so anyway, we were kind of didn't know what kind of do. We felt we were a bit like country bumpkins, being noticed by the big guys, and they got on a plane from Nairobi and flew to Canada. And our community, we don't get that many visitors. So 400 of our leaders all showed up at City Hall, and we had the band playing, kids singing, the children's choir singing, and welcomed them to our community. But as an organization, we were thinking a lot. And we couldn't quite figure it out. How do you become one of the 40 best practices in the world when poverty has actually gone up? And we're supposed to be an anti-poverty organization. We were supposed to make poverty go down. So they said, well, no, we've looked at you over a 10-year period and we've analyzed everything about you. I said, yeah, maybe we're having a lot of success, but the bottom line, nothing's changed. And I said, you know, when I kind of look at my business friends, if they lose shareholder wealth, they get fired, not recognized. And I said, actually, poverty's gone up in our community. You should be firing me, not recognizing me. I actually said that from the podium instead of that was my award speech. Well, that didn't go over so well. And I remember getting off the stage and nobody clapped. But, you know, it was interesting because they understood what I was saying. And we had this idea. It was a crazy idea. And it was kind of like, what if we got everyone in the community to change just a little bit? Could we, if everybody just changed a little bit, if business would pay just a little more, if government was a little more flexible, if human service organizations worked a little differently, could we actually reduce poverty on a population level, right? So not just provide good services, but actually reduce poverty. And you know what was interesting? There were a lot of business leaders in the crowd that day. And they told me they didn't clap because I had moved them, not because I had pissed them off. They gave me $1.5 million. This is back in the early 90s. That's a lot of money, private money. We wouldn't accept any government money. And we launched Opportunities 2000, and it was 1996 when we started. And our goal was to create the lowest level of poverty in history in our country. That our little town was going to have the lowest level of poverty in the entire country. And we were going to do that in 4 years, and it was going to be a gift to the world. It was our gift to the millennium. They were so excited. The chambers of commerce, all the business leaders, the not-for-profit organizations, all levels of government got involved, and it was like the 4 best years of my life. Matter of fact, I resigned as executive director just to run this program. It had just gone out of control. And guess what? The millennium came, and we just missed our target by a couple of hundred families, but we achieved it. We created the lowest level of poverty. And
that was in your town?
In our town, yeah,
okay.
52 projects. And we brought poverty down to about 11%, which was the lowest in the country at the time. So, you know, I did that. We did that as a community. And then a number of philanthropic families, the McConnell family and the Maytree family, Alan Broadbent, venture capitalists, they approached us and said, will you go national? And I said, oh, come on. I literally said no. You know, I barely know how to do this locally. And they said, we'll teach you. And they took me under their wing, particularly Tim Broadhead, who's now on our board of the McConnell family, took me under his wing. And Alan Broadbent was really a great strategist. And they helped to design the Tamarack Institute that then founded Vibrant Communities. And we started with 15 cities, and now we're in just around 400. When we started, there was not one city other than our own that had a poverty reduction strategy. Matter of fact, many mayors laughed at us when we said, will you develop a poverty reduction strategy? They said, that's the role of the provincial government or the federal government. Well, we said they don't have one either, so we went to them, right? But now, you know, here we are 20 years later, The federal government has an aggressive poverty reduction strategy, very progressive. Every province, that's like in the United States, every state and every territory, every province and territory has a poverty reduction strategy, and well over 400 cities. 98.2% of all people living in poverty live in a city that has a poverty reduction strategy and is now a member of Cities Reducing Poverty. Or I'll tell you the new name with your last question, John.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was a long journey and an exciting journey, and I gotta tell the end of the story here, John. And I'll talk more about this later. In January of 2020, that was just before COVID hit, we announced the lowest poverty rate in the history of Canada. We just broke 10%, and that means 90% of all Canadians are not living in poverty. We reduced poverty in the last 5 years by 1.3 million Canadians. It's very significant given there's only 35 million of us. So that would be the equivalent in the United States of 13 million people moving out of poverty in 5 years. We're just thrilled. And matter of fact, back then, I was really clear that we were going to end poverty before I died. I was so convinced.
Now, along this way, we ran into you, and you ran into us at the AssetBased Institute. Can you tell me how we happened to show up in your work, the asset-based approach?
Yeah, I mean, we built it in. I mean, it was interesting because, you know, what McConnell did is they told us to look at what were the core ideas. And we were to promote the core ideas of what worked, not so much the process. Now, interestingly enough, Alan of Maytree, he was much more interested in the process. So, you know, we had these two bosses. One made us look at process, the other one made us look at ideas. But when you looked at, so we said, what are the 5 core ideas that we wanted to advance? So number one, we wanted communities to focus on reducing poverty versus alleviating it. And what we came to realize is that almost our entire human service system was focused on alleviating poverty. Matter of fact, we had a fight with Revenue Canada, which gives us charitable status. You're not actually allowed to be a charity for ending poverty. You could only alleviate it. You could only make the lives of the poor better. Isn't that remarkable? And we were saying, no, we want less poor, not better poor. That was our number one
idea.
goal. Number two was that it had to be comprehensive. Like what we said is that, you know, better housing doesn't reduce poverty. Even a better job doesn't reduce poverty, right? Improving someone's mental health, dealing with their addictions, dealing with their life circumstances, none of those reduce poverty, right? What reduces poverty is a whole person. So a person has to have a good place to live, has to have a good job, has to be healthy. All those things combined help someone to permanently move out of poverty, right? So we needed to think comprehensively. And what had happened in the human service system is that we all became surgeons, right? You know, we gave away food, and then we became specialized in how we gave away food, right? You know, we had job search, and then how we did job search, and then we looked at, we had so many supports, and it just seemed like every agency. And then I used to hold up a smartphone, right? I don't even know where mine is, but you know, I used to hold up a smartphone and say, imagine if Apple made you go to 11 different organizations to activate this smartphone. How many of you think that this smartphone would be very popular, right? But that's how we've broken down human services, right? But all we really want is a whole person. We need people to heal. We need people to be strong. We need people to to have the skills, right? It's very common sense. So we said, no, we got to stop thinking in piecemeal. We have to start thinking comprehensively. The third thing we said is we need to think about assets versus problems. So, John, we started on a macro level. A community has many assets. Matter of fact, we were fond of going into a community and they were just thought, oh, poverty was horrible here. Oh, it's just horrible. There's 15% poor. And they would take us to all the worst places in the community. And then I would say, hold on, could we make the second half of the tour about the 85% who aren't poor? Right? Because they just wanted to show us the bad stuff. So I said, now, how are we going to get those 85%? To welcome in the 15% who are poor. How are we going to get them to change how they view the poor? And then we moved to a second level. That was our first level, the macro. The second level was, and it was business leaders who told us that this was necessary. They said all those people living in poverty, they also have assets. You need to go and ask them what they're good at, what they want to contribute, right? Well, you have to involve them in this whole process, right? So we started involving lived and living experience. And, you know, in Canada, there was a development philosophy. It's called the three-legged stool of civil society: government, business, the voluntary or non-government organizations. We added a fourth one, and that was the citizens, the people that were being helped. And so our model says, whoever you're trying to help, right, whose lives are going to be better because you exist, those are the people with lived and living experience of the problem you're trying to solve. So they need to be involved. Not only that you listen to them, but they need to be involved in the leadership and in the planning and in the idea generation, because they have the gift of experience and they're going to help us, sorry to you vegetarians, cut closer to the bone, right? Get closer to the issue and bring all of their experience to the situation. So reduce rather than alleviate, comprehensive versus single issue, asset-based. And then the fourth one was multi-sector. We said you can't end poverty by the not-for-profit sector being the lead or government being the lead. Everyone has a role to play. Business has a role to play. People with living in poverty have a role to play. The voluntary sector has a role to play. And so everything we did was to involve those four sectors. And in particular, we were looking for where we had consensus. When the four sectors agreed on an idea, we knew to move that forward. And then our last one, which I think was the most brilliant idea of the five, it was called learning and change. And we would just say to communities, if we knew what to do, there wouldn't be any poverty here. So let's learn our way out of this. Let's not think that we're experts. And I said, the first year of your strategy development, and I'll talk about that a little later on, John, the first year needs to unlearn, to unthink, to let go of what you think needs to happen to end poverty. You need to engage together and learn together, and you will find your way through. So those were the five core principles of our movement. And that's what we drove across the country. And that's what people adopted. And, you know, John, it's so interesting. They were all developed in the first year. I remember 18 years later, I had done this a number of times, but 18 years later, I went back to members with all these other sophisticated things that I would want them to adopt. Couldn't get any of them to agree on those. But these five principles, they still was 100% consensus that they were the five core reasons for this work to exist.
Well, that's a framing that begins to get people's heads together in a useful way. I know also then that you began to develop some stages that you suggested that they go through in order to take the principles and let the wheel touch the ground, that it would become real. So can you give us a sort of a staging then of how people
Absolutely.
proceed?
And this is kind of how we do it. It's how Heather does her work too. We begin to work with cities and we prospect them. Who's ready for this type of an idea? Because not all are. And we're looking for people that are innovators, or when there's been a difficult situation unfolding, or a particular donor, or the United Way often wants to start something like this. They've been inspired by our story. So we call those emerging communities. And what we do with them is we just involve them. We get them involved in the learning community, come to learning events, learn about collective impact, learn about community change, learn about asset-based community development, get inspired. Hear from other cities. But then they move into the startup phase. And the startup phase is when they bring their formation team together. And right away we say, find a leading business person or two. That's always our test. Find 2 or 3 people with lived and living experience of poverty, right? Who are going to come and they're going to be making decisions on your formation right from the beginning. Oh boy, the not-for-profit sector, they often fall off their chair. They don't even know where to start to bring someone in with lived and living experience of poverty. None of them are on their board. They're all their clients, you know? And I said, okay, well, who are your favorite clients? Maybe that's where to start, right? Those are in the olden days. Now it's much more sophisticated because the lived and living experience work has become very popular in Canada beyond our movement. And a government leader or two, and a not-for-profit leader or two. So come together. And what we normally do is we put them through the top 100 exercise. So we get them to identify the 100 people that if they all agreed on what needed to be done, we're pretty sure things would change. And I mean, maybe Heather, you could even put that in the chat box for people, the top 100 exercise. It's one of the most popular exercises that Tamarack does. And it was in my first book, Community Conversations. And essentially what we do is we get them to identify 100, but there's always a twist. 25 need to be business leaders. 25 need to be government leaders. And when we say government in Canada, we mean mush. Municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals, all levels of government, all government-funded agencies. Not-for-profits, and then 25 people with lived and living experience of poverty. Then there's one last twist. Now try to identify those people who are network builders. These are the people that have this uncanny way of inviting 10 people to a meeting and 8 or 9 always show up. So we're looking for those connectors, those people who have the ability to connect. And that's how we fan it out. So that's in the startup phase. Then when we have enough people in play, we move into the planning phase, or what we call it, the building a common agenda phase. And normally there is a listening team that is formed. And that listening team is often 10, 15, 20 volunteers. And they go out and listen to people living in poverty. And more importantly, people who've moved out of poverty recently. And they hear their stories. And then they hear their stories about what life is really like. And they feed that back into the network, right? There's always a leadership roundtable that forms. Usually 10 or 12 people, that their job at this point is to make sense of all of those stories. And then there's usually 4 or 5 action teams that get formed, and they are looking for quick wins of reducing poverty. I remember one of my favorite quick wins was they identified that there were in Des Moines, Iowa. They identified that there was like 2,000 families on the waiting list for affordable housing. And their goal was to move 10% out without any added supports. And they did it. They got all the data. They found the people who were least vulnerable, who maybe least needed affordable housing, worked with the private sector, bridged them with some financing, bridged them with some vouching for them, and they got 10% off of the waiting list just by working together. So those are the kind of action teams that happen, just so we can get a bunch of quick wins and we can learn how to flex our muscle and all learn to work together a little bit. Now, a year goes by. I always say never develop a plan in less than a year. Not a strategic plan, but a common agenda, right? By this point, I want to have on average 1,000 to 2,000 names in the database, right? I want to have 100 to 150 organizations in a town of maybe 150,000, 200. I want to have that number of groups that are actively involved. And so when the plan gets tabled, I want to have around 100 smaller towns. We could have less, but I want them all to sign on to the plan. I want businesses to sign on to the plan, because if we're going to call it a community plan, then it needs to be owned by the community, not by one or two organizations that are now going to go out and sell it. And what I want is that every one of those communities sees themselves implementing the plan. So the plan isn't going to be implemented by someone. The plan is going to be implemented by us. And we call those mutually reinforcing activities. And we find sweet spots when business, government, the voluntary sector, and lived experience people agree on something, and there's a role for all four of them to make it successful. So we think comprehensively, both in the idea, but also in the way that we act together. So it's a whole community response all the time. And that's the planning phase. And what I remember in Des Moines, Iowa, it was so funny. And I'm a preacher, always been a preacher. They were at the event. There was like 250 people, and there must have been 80. Started out with one guy saying, "I believe in the Central Iowa poverty reduction strategy, and our name stands behind that plan." Sat down, and another person said, "We are the Salvation Army. We had an idea. We put it in that plan. It's in that plan. This is our plan." And it was like we were at a Billy Graham crusade, right? It just kept going and going, and the wave got greater and greater. And it was just so exciting, right? To see who all owned that plan. Well, then we move into the implementing phase. And often there's a small staff that's hired, 2 to 3, 4 people. And their job is to coordinate the activities of the network. And there's working groups around every strategy. And those working groups are changing the way that they're doing things. We're asking executive directors, every executive director, every business leader to give up 10% of their time for the next 4 years to dedicate to this plan. We let them think about what 10% means to them. Half a day. And that's the kind of thing that starts to happen. And then a momentum just starts to build. And it's like all people of faith, miracles just start happening. And you see it every day, John. My favorite story of the Bible is the feeding of the 5,000, right? Because, they're talking. And if you're a good Mennonite, you can't go to a talk without having a break for food. And this little boy comes up to Jesus and says, "We're hungry. Feed us." And it was a really interesting thing because the little boy gave Jesus his food that his mom had packed up so beautifully. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. They all looked around, and then they looked to their neighbors to see if they had food. And they all started sitting in circles all along that mountain, and they shared their food. And what was so miraculous about that is after all that food was shared, there was all these baskets of food left over. It was so interesting that Luke would capture that all this food was left over and it was brought to feed the poor, right? The assets of the masses, right? And it's that we build in this kind of hive effect, right? That when people start to believe, I have no doubt that we can end poverty in the United States of America. There is way more money than we need. There's way more talent than we need. There's way more jobs than we need. We don't need more money. We need the will. We need that little boy to go to Jesus and say, here, have my food. And that inspires everyone to give. And we all know that intuitively. And it wouldn't hurt that much. And that's why we call it the 10%. If everybody just gave 10%, just changed 10%, how would that work? So that's the implementation phase. And then we move to the sustainability phase, which is much more technical. It's about fundraising. It's about leadership development and all of that. But those are the phases.
Could you say something about barriers and how you have used the idea that there are barriers as a way of organizing people?
Just explain that more, John.
Well, in Des Moines, it seemed to me that what happened was that there was a series of analyses as to what had deterred people from reaching beyond poverty, getting out of poverty, that there were factors that kept them from moving out of poverty, and the work groups, I thought, were organized around those barriers.
Ah, okay. That's why it was called Opportunities Des Moines.
I put it in a negative. Right.
It was an asset.
Yeah,
So,
right.
So, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I honestly don't believe, and neither did the people of Des Moines, the good people of Des Moines. They are really an amazing people. And Elizabeth there at the United Way is just one of the best community developers you could ever imagine. Their thought was that nobody wants to be poor, right? My very first job in my very first year, this guy came into my office and I had a job for him. And I said, okay, I'm going to give you a job. And I said, it's with X amount per hour. And he said, I wouldn't get out of bed for that. I said, well, then get out of my office. I can't help you. Came back 3 days later in tears and said, can I still have that job? And I said, well, why did you turn it down the first time? And he said, because no one's ever offered me a job before. He said, I've never worked. I don't know anybody who's ever worked. He said, I was scared out of my, and how, like, and so I said, okay. He said, do I still have that job? And I said, yeah. And I said, what do you need? He said, I need work boots. I need a decent pair of pants. I need a jacket. I said, okay. And I went, I had a loan fund that a business person had given me. I just gave him a few $100s right there on the spot. And I said, you pay me back whenever you can. He did. Right? So, like, it's really important for me to understand and believe that nobody wants to be poor. And that people are addicted to drugs. They are hurting. They have gotten themselves into horrible circumstances. They have become lazy, not in their being, but in their minds somehow. And opportunities can bring that to life. People believing in others will bring that to life, and it will heal that, right? And I don't mean healed in a miraculous way. It's just very simple, and there's something about human nature, about opportunity. In the previous organization in Coda, we helped 1,100 people who were living on welfare start small businesses. And our motto was, if you can steal a car, you could probably sell it. Right? So then we thought, well, there's a lot of skills in that person. Let's just turn it from stealing to a business idea. And they did, I'm joking a little bit, and I'm not saying there aren't bad people in the world, there are, but for the very biggest part. And so what Des Moines did is they said, okay, what are the barriers of someone coming out of jail? Big problem in the United States. How do we become a welcoming community here in Des Moines? Right? Someone, has I don't know, there was something about a second or third driving conviction and you lose your license. Well, you lose your license in a rural community like Des Moines, you're probably going to live in poverty. So they figured out a better punishment, right? Because they didn't want people moving into poverty, right? They figured out about the, housing and the barriers to better housing, the barriers to improving jobs. Well, it was exciting because once it got going, the largest insurance company in Des Moines, I didn't know this, but Des Moines, Iowa is one of the big insurance capitals of Canada. The CEO, out of the blue, they had already appointed someone to the leadership team. They already had given money to hire staff for this project. But out of the blue, I don't know, did he have an epiphany? It was like a Scrooge moment. Maybe not. He certainly wasn't Scrooge. He was a lovely man. Just announced, no one in this company will be making less than $15 an hour. And they had a massive call center. Now, all the other insurance companies went, what the bleep? You can't do that. Now, we all got to pay $15 an hour. And he said, that's right. Right? And so the minimum wage is a bit better than $8 back then. Right? Almost double the minimum wage. So that's the kind of stuff that happens. And it's remarkable in every community that we do this work, when the human spirit gets excited about opportunity for others, and they can see true growth. We have that innate, like I really believe that. And I believe that about the United States. We innately want betterment for others. I don't know if that helps, John.
Oh yeah, yep, that's it. Let me ask you one other thing before we open up here, and that is, do you have some ways that you measure the results of your work? How do you decide whether or not it's worked your work?
Well, I mean, number one, I'm a bit of a reductionist. I want less poor. And so I want to see it, and I want to see it at the population level, right? So, St. John, New Brunswick, when I first started working with them, a guy by a Royal Bank, the largest bank in Canada, one of their top executives lived there, and he retired, and he went for a walk, and he met a homeless person, and he was so bored that he said, "You want to go for coffee with me?" And the homeless person said, "Okay." And they went for coffee, changed his life. Next thing he did was call all of his friends, including the Irvings, J.K. Irving. I think it's the second wealthiest family in Canada. J.K. Irving gave him an office. The office is there to this day, right below him, right below his office in the skyscraper. He gave a big office to Vibrant St. John. And I was there working with this group, and they said, Paul, talk to me about what poverty is like outside of St. John. I said, well, it's probably 14% on average in Canada. That back then it was 15. They said, what are we again? I said, you're about 28, 29. You're pretty high here, maybe one of the highest in Canada. And they said, oh, okay. And I said, so what are you thinking? He said, well, I think I just want to be like everybody else. Let's get it down to 14. Guess what? 20 years later, they're down at 14. That's 14% down in poverty in 20 years. Every year, Liz Weaver, who is my co-CEO at Tamarack, we found her developing the Hamilton, the Best Place to Raise a Child, one of our key partners in our work. and they were at the top 10% of child poverty in the country. And in 5 years, they flipped it around. They were at the bottom 10% of child poverty. So for us, population level change is the magic marker. And, you know, the whole Tamarack Vibrant Communities vision for the next 10 years is we deeply want to understand that. And I think, John, you've heard that I'm retiring, not so much from Tamarack, but I wanted to retire to write and teach more. And my next book is going to be about exactly what I'm talking about today. And I'm going to really tackle this issue of population level outcomes. Now, one of the key things, and probably the biggest learning here today about change, and it's also a big learning for everybody that cares about asset-based community development, is that we've stopped talking about attribution. Attribution. So who did it? And we try to break up a piece of something. And we particularly teach funders, stop thinking attribution. It is a destructive force in community change. You start funding smaller and smaller, more micro, so that you can say, we did that. You start measuring contribution. Let's come up with a common agreement. In collective impact, we called that a shared measurement. Let's come up with an agreement, just like St. John did. We want to be 14%. Okay, everybody, that's our goal. You have lots of your own individual goals, I get it, but our common agenda is getting down to 14% poverty. And every time we drop a point, in Des Moines, Iowa, this is what's so cool about that city. Every year, they get a state report that shows how many people are economically advancing, right? 2 days before the report comes out, there's an article on the front page asking leaders what they think the number is going to be this year. And the day it comes out, there's a massive community celebration. And there are reports written. It's like the election every year. And in the last 3 years in a row, they have moved 25,000 people every year toward financial independence. It's a massive change in Des Moines, Iowa. They have again reached one of the lowest levels of poverty that they've ever experienced. So again, it's a whole community, and they celebrate and they dance and everyone's excited, and that fuels them for the next year. So I know, you know, there's many micro things we do, and we have some really top level evaluators that work with us, and even that we have on our team. But none of those compare with this notion of population level outcomes. You know, if we want there to be less homeless, then we need to have less homeless. It doesn't matter how many homeless we help. If we still have more homeless, something's wrong. It doesn't matter how many people got jobs, right? If there's still poverty that is growing and increasing, the solution isn't right, right? And I think it's important to recognize, John, and that was the last question. I got to come up with a crescendo. We just had a conference last week. Was it last week or the week before, Heather? I think it was last week. And we had 1,030 people come out. In the United States, that would be, again, probably a 13,000 person conference. And they came to talk about the end of poverty. And we wanted to bring forth the idea of the end of poverty so that we didn't come out of COVID forgetting that goal. And we changed our name. After 20 years, the movement changed its name from Cities Reducing Poverty to Communities Ending Poverty. And we celebrated the fact that we had reduced poverty, ended poverty for 1.3 million Canadians. And then we laid out a plan for the last 10%. right? 42% of people living in poverty in Canada work. Just take that in for a second. It's quite similar in the United States. The vast majority of people that live in poverty, it's by far the single level. The trouble is they don't work full time and they don't work full year. So we have now fought for a $15 minimum wage. It's almost universal in Canada. The federal government has adopted it as universal. We've got to get a few provinces to come up to that. If you work full time all year at $15 an hour, if you're a single person, you will not be living in poverty. If you're a single mom and you work basically 3 days a week, right? Even 2.5 days a week, part-time, you get $15 an hour. Then you get the Canada Child Benefit, which can be as high as between $4,000 and $6,000 per child. You get the worker tax benefit, the low-income worker tax benefit. We have a number of other programs that you tie into. You will not be living in poverty, right? But what we need to do is we need to fundamentally change how work is unfolding. And I think during COVID, we've heard this term essential worker. Well, they sure aren't being paid and treated as essential.
Right.
And so that's the driver now going to be in Canada. It's going to be big and it's going to hurt, right? But we're going to say, right, you have to treat workers better. And it makes no sense because almost all the workers that are working in poverty work in the service sector. So we're not competing. It's not a competitiveness issue. If we made these kind of labor changes mandatory, it will have a slight effect on inflation. A slight effect on inflation. That's the only effect it will have. And we will save billions and billions of dollars. And once we get through working poverty, we're down to probably 5% poverty, maybe 6%. And at that point, we're arguing these people aren't living in poverty, right? It's a health issue. It's often mental health or physical health or whatever, age. And we need to come up with what's called the guaranteed basic income. We've had right across the board in our country, right? We can't afford it right now, but if we solved working poverty, we could easily afford a guaranteed basic income. And guess what, John? 2 things, all we need, and we end poverty in Canada for good.
I like the way you put it. It's small thing, right? But it has huge impact. I mean, constantly.
It has huge impact, but it's not that hard to do.
Yeah, right.
We've already done the big stuff as a country.
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't it be? And that's what we're saying now. Okay, I'll end with this because I'm on. I like to be on behind the pulpit. Just one last statement, right? Like, wouldn't it be great if Canada could say to the world, we ended poverty in memory of COVID? All of this suffering was worth something because it opened our minds and it opened our hearts. And we agreed that poverty should not exist.
Now, I think with that kind of inspiration, we've got people who want to engage with the questions that remain. But you've done such a wonderful job that I'm not sure they're important questions because you covered it so well and with such joy. I think that's so important. So, Kim, what do we know in terms of questions?
Well, so if anybody has questions, you can add them to the chat now, and I'll keep feeding them to Paul and John. We do have one question to start with. Imani is asking, what if the communities you're working in are 90% poor? How do you move them? Inner city communities that are dense with all the typical problems. Is there something different? I'm going to add this part to it. Is there something different you would do, or how does that, how would you start in that situation?
Paul?
Well, you know, I mean, let's say, so I do a lot of coaching, including in places like Philadelphia, and they have neighborhoods like this, right? But that's not, that isn't a city, right? So I always go regional, because where there's wealth, where there's poverty, there's wealth. Where there's wealth, there's poverty. And often they're sitting right beside one another, right? So I like to look at it from a regional perspective. And then I try to understand, how do we bring to bear the assets of this community toward that neighborhood, right? Now, that neighborhood has tremendous assets as well, but they need external forces and money often to be able to turn itself around, right? So the first thing I would do in a community like that is I would map the income. Where does the wealth come from? Because even in a poor community, there's wealth, right? When you combine it all. So I'm looking, John, for the assets, right? And I'm looking for financial assets. Then I'm looking at all the people in the community. What kind of jobs do they have? Both jobs that are legal and illegal. Again, trying to understand the assets, right? What's going on? I'm trying to understand all of the people that are in that community, because I don't think there's ever a community that's 90% poor all year long. So there's a lot of in and out of poverty. So people move in and out of poverty sometimes 3, 4, or 5 times a year, right? So I'm trying to understand that whole flow of what's going on. And then we're looking for opportunities to make that twice a year, to make that once a year, right? So there's a cycle of when poverty happens, right? Then, of course, we want to start dealing with a number of things. We need to work at community safety is key. And there's ways of taking back the streets. I mean, many of us on this call are experts in that kind of thing. There are, you know, looking at kind of micro projects, everything from community gardens to beautification projects, all the things that create community pride. But then we're going to need some bigger interventions, right? We're going to have to figure out, how do we get better transportation into that community? How do we get good food into that community, you know, with good grocery stores and the like? And then we have to figure out what we're going to do with credit. And there's many organizations now beyond banks. We don't need banks to give credit. Way back in the 90s, I had $1 million bank working with Coda, right? And we gave out loans of $500 to $10,000, and then got them bank ready, as we called it. And eventually the banks came to us and said, anyone you send to us, we'll give them a loan. If you can lend money to people, we had a 98% repayment rate. We could prove that to them. You know, so it's not like it was a bad thing, lending money. So there's all these techniques. I mean, we are so damn good at community development. It is like, we are smarter than we've ever been in history. We have people who are working harder than they've ever worked in history. We know so much about community change. We just got to get in there and do it, right? And open ourselves to it. And we need the Barack Obamas of the world. You know, when the president of the United States, it was the most friggin' inspiring thing of my entire life. And I've never been more inspired again, right? When Melody Barnes, Michelle Obama, Barack Obama created the White House Council on Community Change. You know, John, you know them all. You knew almost everybody at the table. You know, John was a big inspirer of this work with the Obamas. You know, they came through his school of thinking. And when the most powerful person in the world says, we need to work at the community level, right? And, you know, we followed that religiously. And matter of fact, at one point, I was lecturing at the Woodrow Wilson School for Scholars in Washington, and Melody Barnes invited me to come to the White House and meet with her because we had been so, I guess we were just the biggest geeks out there, and she wanted to meet us. But wow, there's no place in the world like the United States in understanding community change, you know. But now let's talk about the barriers. You know, you've got some of the stupidest people in the world, in the United States as well. I'm sorry to say that, you know, but you definitely have the smartest. There's very few of those stupidest ones, and I hate using that term. But my God, like how micro-focused are they on these stupid ideas of free enterprise and pure capitalism? They've never existed. They never will exist, right? We need government intervention. And that's where Canada has been brilliant. You know, we're not socialist. We just have found a way that the system doesn't work. So it requires some level of intervention to turn these places around. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to call anybody stupid. I didn't really.
That's right. One of the things,
you know?
Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed in my years in Canada is that if you're at a gathering, you'll often hear people say, our government. In the United States, we say, the government. It's not ours. And I think that's the difference, why you have the kinds of effective government relations to these kinds of initiatives that are going on in the civilian space. Very good. But next question.
Hey, Mac, were we really on the Mondragon study together? Did you meet me in Mondragon?
We did.
That is just friggin' amazing. Were you like one of the leaders?
Yeah, one of the organizers, yeah.
You bought a pressure cooker for your wife.
I did.
From Mondragon. I remember that. I remember you bringing it. You were so damn proud of that pressure cooker. Did it work as good as you thought it would?
Oh, sure. If I go electrodomesticos, you know, went out of, you know, that's now made in China.
Now.
Yeah.
We were in Mondragon, Spain, with the and Mac was one of the organizers with the Jesuits.
Yeah,
changed my life, Mac. That was like that's almost as important in my life as John McKnight.
That's the Jesuit pedagogy.
Yeah, right. And I can say the same. Kim.
Yeah.
Other question.
All right. So Cicely would like to know if you can give some specific examples on how the businesses participated in poverty reduction.
Good.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. You know, there's so many ways. Obviously, you know, I told you that story of the insurance company that just raised the wages. You know, another business that I love, what they did was they had a training center that was only used a few months a year, and they opened it up to people, particularly single parents, to come and do training, and they paid for the training. Helped a lot of people find jobs doing that. You know, the banks have gone in Canada, have gone toe to toe with the predatory lenders. And matter of fact, there's places in Canada where the banks have set up competitor businesses to intentionally bankrupt the predatory lenders. That's pretty cool stuff when you see that. You know, we've had banks in Canada that have just, I don't know how it happened, but they have become active lenders to the poor, giving credit to the poor to start small businesses. And they need credit just like everybody else, right? So that's another really interesting way. Many of our business leaders fight the government and have a lot more power than we do. And they get us into political doors and they open them and they tell these politicians, that's how we're going to end working poverty. It's not me as an activist that's going to end working poverty. It's the business leaders of Canada that are going to end working poverty. And, you know, go ahead, sorry.
Can you describe in a little practical way what happens when a quarter of all the people seeking to get change are from business? I think it would be interesting to people. How does that change the dialogue? What goes on in a room where a quarter of the people are business people?
Well, number one, they ask some very basic questions. The first thing business people asked at me and in the voluntary sector, where's the customer? Why is the customer nowhere to be seen? Right? Why are we not listening to the customer? And I couldn't figure it out at the beginning. What do you mean by the customer? Well, people living in poverty, right? They're important in all of this, aren't they? So let's find out what they need. Let's find out how we can help them, right? Not how we can do stuff for them, but how we can help them with what they want. That was number one. There's a whole thinking system that business brings in that isn't any better than what we have in the not-for-profit sector, but it's different and it's effective, right? And we need it. There's a whole thing about, there's a big conversation about capital, just about the need for money. You know, like we wait for the government to fund affordable housing. Most business leaders don't think that way. They think about how do we create a sustainable business model to provide housing that can be afforded by that target group. Mm-hmm. They don't want to sit around and wait. They figure it out. And that's really helpful in the conversation because as a not-for-profit sector, we have some know-how that when we add it to their know-how, we come up with some really cool solutions. And then government becomes a partner rather than a driver of change.
Yeah, let's go back to
another one is that just one last thing, John, is that they start to fight bad business practices, right? Why is it that Costco can pay on average $21 an hour, but Walmart seems to think they're going to go bankrupt if they pay less than minimum, if they pay less than minimum, more than minimum wage, and yet they're basically the same company. They have the same. They're in the same field. They're playing in the same game. Why is that? And so they start to question that, and that's what I'm questioning. I'm asking very basic, right? We don't want businesses that contribute to poverty. When we have businesses playing in the same game that are ending poverty, right? Let's put an equal playing field and let's not allow people to get super rich through a predatory business practice. That's all we're asking. I mean, it's nothing rocket science at all.
And along those lines, in the question of business, there's a couple of questions here. One having to do with when you have a history of distrust among sort of the business community, how do you get around that? And also how do things like systematic oppression, how do you navigate that when it comes to community building?
Although they're two very different things.
Two very different. So one, yeah. So I'm actually throwing two questions at you, which I shouldn't have done. So, but you
take the first one.
Let's start with, like everywhere you go, there are good people, right? I have never been anywhere where there aren't good people, and I volunteered for 3 years. In the maximum security penitentiary in my hometown. Everyone was a lifer in that penitentiary. And there were lots of good people in that penitentiary. Okay? Matter of fact, I'm going to just stray here a little bit, John. I remember being a 9-year-old in a very conservative church, and the pastor had just done a fire and brimstone sermon about needing to be saved, because we were so evil. And I remember we were a church of 400. a little boy. I walked up to the front of the church after, and I challenged him. I said, I don't know where you got that from, but when I read that Bible, there's a lot of good people in there. And I walked away, you know, and I think that about business. There are amazing business leaders who care deeply and who probably do a lot more good in the world than I do, you know, and we just got to find them and we got to invite them in. And we got to believe that they're there. And, you know, often when we think that there are people that are, you know, part of the bad guys, that's our problem more than it is theirs. It's not real. It's just like they think we're socialists, you know, on our side. We're not. We all want what's good. Now, I don't know, like, I don't understand oppression in the United States. I understand it in Canada. But there's some serious shit going on in the US, and it kind of goes down deep. And I don't know, like I'm just watching the first 2 episodes of the Underground Railroad on I think it's Prime, or is it Netflix? What are those two? What do you do during COVID? Has anybody watched it? Wow. That's serious stuff going on, you know, and I don't know, like, it's really deep, huh? But, you know, again, I have spent the better part of my career traveling the United States, like John has, of Canada and the United States, never as much as John. I've never met, actually, someone that would be intentionally, like, an intentional oppressor. I would say that they're quite the opposite. And I don't know what that means. I just know that there's a whole lot of people that want this to end. And they aren't just, you know, I remember after spending 3 years hosting dialogues across the entire province of Alberta with all the Aboriginal leaders. They invited me to facilitate a very, very important meeting for them. And after all that time, I finally had the cred, I thought anyway. I asked this question in a circle of 20 Aboriginal elders. I said, what do you do with the fat guy who cares?
Say it again.
What do you do with the fat guy who cares? The fat white guy who cares.
Who cares? Okay.
What do you do with the fat white guy who cares? The most taboo question you could ever ask. Huh? And they accepted me for asking it. Because I'm just saying there are so many of us that want this to end. Right? How do we all unite? Not just your fight. I know that that's not right, and I know that it's, I don't know, but we want it to end. How do we get it to end? And the stuff that's happened in the United States, you know, the racism that is so deep in some people. It's not America. It's not the America that I know. But there is a streak of it that is deep and it's large. We got to figure that out. I don't think anybody ever hates anybody in that way. There are some that have been taught to hate, you know. I remember my Buddhist, the Buddhist monk that I was studying under taught me that one moment of anger is worth 3 weeks of meditating. You always remember that, you know. So I kept thinking to myself, okay, you know, if we hate, what does it do to our being, to our soul? That was a really ridiculous answer to a pretty simple question. I don't know, Kim. Mm-hmm. Whoever asked that question. Oppression is I just never understood it. And I experienced it as an immigrant that smelled, that couldn't speak the language, that, you know, that looked different, that looked funny. But it's not the same. It's not the same of the way that Aboriginal people in Canada are mistreated, and that you know, many African Americans are treated. I don't understand it, and it really hurts to watch it.
Yeah. Kim, we got time, I think, for about one more question. You gotta.
Let me just, this is a little different, but Robert lives in Connecticut, where he says they have 168 separate governments. We have no counties. Each community acts like its own fiefdom, hoarding the resources it has. Several of those communities are among the wealthiest in the world, and yet we have 4 of the poorest cities in the United States. What do you think of a strategy for this type of situation?
It's a very long answer, but the whole notion of collective impact, it's not a panacea. But what's interesting about collective impact is it asks you to develop a common agenda. And that requires you to work at a regional level, even if there are those fiefdoms. And you see those fiefdoms that he talks about, all these separate units, they're really kind of, there's a political agenda and there is a technical agenda. Often the way governments are, they manipulate those technical agendas to their end. And then there's a social agenda, which is the people. And so there's a part of needing to break all that down and to, first of all, soften the edges of it all. And the common agenda process helps us do that. And that's why I say never develop a plan within the first year. Spend a year unknowing, right? To understand what we have in common, to understand the assets that we share. You know, I was working on a peace project. This was part of the Woodrow Wilson School for Scholars, and there was a person there from Israel, and he was a Palestinian, and he was trying to create peace between Israel and Palestine. Of course, right now that's pretty important. It's a tough time there now. And what he did is he just followed the river all the way up. And he got all the mayors of the river to start talking to one another on both sides of the border, and created a learning community amongst them. And they didn't learn about peace, they learned about water and the water they shared. And that's what created peace. Because when they learned about the water they shared, they came to understand that if that water was not healthy, if that water didn't flow, all of them were at risk. And so they learned to work together. And I think that that's a really important way of looking at that question. We have a lot in common. We have a lot of vested interest in those 4 poorest communities not being so. I recently was interviewed, and I'll end with this, John. The interviewer asked me why poverty? You could have chosen anything. And I said, as a people, we experienced some of the most horrible things that humanity can throw at a people. About half of my people died in that period, wiped out. And as I grew up, I just wanted to make sure this never happened again. I didn't want it to happen to my people, and I didn't want to ever have it happen to anyone else. And I just decided that the number one thing we need to work on, if we are going to find peace in the world, is to end poverty. And so that's become my life's work. And everything else we do, including deepening community, including working on environmental issues and in working on youth futures, It all comes down to that one goal at Tamarack. It all comes down to all the work we do to end poverty, and that's also asset-based community development. I think the greatest ending of poverty is to say, you have a gift.
Right.
You are worthy. Come join me, and we will find a solution.
We need you. We need you desperately.
It's so lovely. You know, the greatest compliment, John, I need your help. Oh,
Yes,
I love those
absolutely.
words. Those words melt me every time.
Yep.
I need your help.
And I think we've all seen in the last hour or so a quality in you that allows the possibility that you're presenting to happen. I don't think that the small programs and anger will get us out of our hole, but it's an understanding of the nature of the possibilities of human beings, and almost relentless you are in saying, I think you are able. I think together we can do this. And in every community I know of, it's a couple people like that that make things get started. They don't make them change, but they bring the vision, they bring the spirit that says, there is another way. There are better angels here. Let's fly together, right? So, Kim, let me turn it back to you. I know we have some information about how we might get in touch with Tamarack and ABCD. Yeah.
Right. Well, so we're bringing us to an end of the discussion, and I do want to thank Paul and John for the wonderful conversation and sharing your wisdom with us today, and to thank the audience, all of you who attended today and put in your thoughtful comments and great questions. If you'd like to learn more about these type of ABCD events or future trainings, I'm going to put in the chat here a place where you can sign up for ABCD emails that will alert you to these type of events. And we will hoping to have some trainings, virtual trainings coming up this year. You can also visit our events page at the ABCD Institute at abcdinstitute.org, and we join us on Facebook at the ABCD Institute. And I'm going to be sending a recording around in a couple days, and I'll include resources that, you know, a lot of people put some great links in the chat. I'll include that. I'll include more information about the Tamarack Institute. Just, you know, you should be, everybody who signed up for this call will receive that email in a couple of days. So thank you so much for learning with us today, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks,
Wonderful.
John. All the best.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks back. Good to see you again.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Likewise.